Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody. Today we are going to be building the 1/35th scale Tiger one from Tamiya. If you haven't already, you can watch my review of this kit via the link above. In this video, I'm going to cover the build of the kit, adding resin parts, and the application of Zimmerit. Without further ado, let's crack on. The first stage is the hull components and suspension arms. I cut all the arms from the sprues using a pair of flat-sided snips. Then to clean up, I carefully use a scalpel and some fine sandpaper. This is the process I use on all components once snipped. Therefore, I won't bore you showing you every single time I cut a component out. Last thing we need for this section is the rear side of the hull. Once all is cut out and cleaned up, we can start to assemble. First piece to go on is the rear plate. As always with Tamiya, it goes together smooth as butter. Next, we can attach all the suspension arms. For all plastic parts, I'm using Tamiya extra thin cement. I use the quick dry cement to ensure a solid hold, then attach the rear idle wheel adjuster. Once all is fitted, we can start cutting out the sprockets, mounts, and wheels. Even though this is a late variant Tiger, there are still a lot of wheels to cut out and clean up. Just a case of taking your time, cleaning, sanding, and avoiding creating any flat spots. Finally, when all the parts are cut out, we can start constructing the mounting areas, sprockets and wheels. All very simple stuff here, just a fair few to get through. With all the wheels cut, cleaned and constructed, I now test fit the wheels on the hull. I'm not using any glue here, as I want to paint them all separately. Next up, I start constructing some of the parts for the rear of the hull, starting with the exhaust stacks. These required a little filling and sanding to eradicate the seam. To do this, I apply some white putty over the seam and leave to cure. I will sand these down later. In the meantime, I cut out and clean up the remaining rear parts to use later. I won't be attaching anything to the hull until I have done the Zimmerit. I will also need to carefully cut off all the clamps from the tools, as I will be using photo-etch ones. Once the putty is dry, I carefully cut off the excess and sand smooth. Now I empty the wheels from the hull to test fit the rear stacks and guards. Then I fit the top of the exhaust stacks, of which took a bit of jiggery pokery to get right. With the stacks done and set aside, I now start on the top deck and front plate of the Tiger. As I will be using photo-etch mud guards, I need to remove the plastic ones. I'm probably not using the right tool for the job here, but I carefully score the area I want to remove. I keep going, and keep going until eventually I can carefully snap it off and clean it up. I plan to add my own weld beads to the seams of this tank, so I carefully scrape out the old ones with a pair of tweezers. I repeat the process with the other mud guard, then I start constructing the front elements of the tank. The first is the sight guard, and then the front plate. Next is the front hull machine gun. This is fitted on the inside without any glue, then held in position with a bracket that is glued in place. This allows the machine gun to move freely. The engine hatch is next, just a few vents and handles to be glued in place. Now the top deck can be attached to the hull. As with a lot of Tamiya kits, the fitment is superb. I put in place and carefully tack in position using quick dry cement. Next, the engine hatch can be fitted, followed by the driver and machine gunner's hatches. These can be glued open if you want to put figures in there. With the main hull section complete, we now move on to the main gun and turret assembly. There is a bit of detail for the inside of the gun in case you have hatches open. It's not mega, but is enough. I am, however, having my hatches closed on this model, so I didn't spend too much time cleaning up the interior parts. Now the main turret assembly. There are these stands in case you have figures. The escape hatch is also fitted at this stage. Next, the two halves of the turret can be fitted together, being careful not to put any glue on the mantlet attachment. This allows the gun to adjust once built. The barrel in this kit is in two pieces. I don't end up using it for that reason, but more on that later. I test fit the top of the turret, then I move on to producing the workable track links. These are aftermarket track links, produced by myself, EJB, and available on my web store. I will leave a link in the description. The first stage was to cut a bunch of pins from the sprue, then we can start constructing sections of the tracks. These were the first production version of these tracks. They now come with a handy stand to enable faster production of the links. All that's required is a small amount of CA glue on the end of each track pin, and voila, workable links. I keep going until I have the correct amount per length. I leave a couple without any glue to allow for potential adjustment. Now they can be test fitted to the tank. This is actually the second fitting, as I needed to remove one link to ensure the fitment was correct. I don't glue the remaining pins in for now, as I will remove them later for easier painting and weathering. I repeat the process on the other side, then it's time to do some work on the top of the turret. First, I need to remove these radio aerial positions. I use a pair of snips for this and clean up with a scalpel. Then, as before on the hull, I scrape out the existing welds from the front of the turret. This time I need to cut them with the scalpel first, then run over them with the tweezers. I use some sandpaper to clean up the area and repeat the process until the gap is deep enough for my own welds to be fitted. This actually took a little while, but it was crucial I didn't slip and take out some of the plating. Next, the hatch is constructed and fitted to the turret. I also run some cement down the groove I have carved out to smooth it a tad. Finally, the lid can be attached to the rest of the turret. Once in place, I start adding some of the top details. The gunner's periscope guard is fixed on, the vent cover, cupola guard, and finally, the mantlet pins. Next up, the rear stowage box for the turret. As with a lot of the other parts, I need to cut off the existing brackets to make room for the photo-etch parts I will fit later. The base is connected and sanded smooth. Not too much attention required, as will mostly be hidden. The box is attached to the turret. It's very much starting to take shape now. The last few plastic parts to be fitted to the turret are the turret machine gun components. The turret can now be fitted to the hull and the Tamiya barrel temporarily attached. This pretty much concludes the main Tamiya kit part of the build. All the tools and equipment will be used, but will need to be adapted prior to fitment later on. Now we start the adaptation part of the build, starting with the turret. I am going to be using my own track clamps and links on the side of the turret, so I need to fill in the existing holes. For this, I am using white putty. Unfortunately, I forgot to record the cleanup of this, but I generously put the putty on, wait for it to dry and carefully cut the excess off. As mentioned earlier, I drew and printed my own resin barrel. This saves all the sanding and filling of the kit part. This again is available on my online store. These are the track brackets that I created. These come either separately or with a set of tracks purchased from my store. I need to put down some styrene blocks on the mounting positions. This is so when I add the Zimmerit, they have a smooth surface to bond to. They are held in place with blue tack for now. I then draw on the position with marker and cement a 1 mm styrene piece in place. Next, the weld beads. Now please bear in mind, this was my first ever pop at this, but the process will remain the same. First, I mix up some smooth type epoxy putty and roll into a thin sausage, the approximate thickness of my weld bead. I use talc powder to stop it sticking to the surface and my fingers. Next, I brush on a small amount of water to the bead area. This helps it adhere to the surface. Then I carefully put the epoxy sausage in place and start pressing it down into the gap. Using the flat end of an old airbrush needle, I start adding the weld pattern. You get a good hour or two before the putty goes hard, so if you make a mistake, it's easy to either start again or repair if necessary. Using the sharp end, I carefully clean up the area. That's how I make the weld beads. I do the same thing again on the other side. Back to hull prep now. I start with scribing the new weld bead areas using the same technique as with the turret and front hull area. As I had to do on the turret for the track clamps, I need to fill in the holes on the top of the hull that normally the tools would fit too. Exactly the same technique again here, fill with putty, cure and clean up. Again, as with the track clamps, I need to make styrene mounting positions for the photo-etch guards on the sides. I start by fitting the kit ones and marking the attachment positions. Next, more filling of holes on both sides and on the rear of the hull. I will also need to put styrene packers here for the rear tools. As mentioned earlier, all this is so I have a flat mounting position once the Zimmerit is applied. Using a piece of 1mm styrene, I cut a small 1mm strip, then cut into 1mm squares. These are then attached onto all the marked positions. With all of the packers fixed in place, I can crack on with the Zimmerit. For this, I am using the standard Milliput epoxy resin. Like with the weld beads, I mix the two parts and roll into a thin sausage. Once I have a fairly thin sausage of epoxy, I cut into little chunks. This makes it easier to thin out once applied. Now using a cocktail stick, I carefully apply and roll the epoxy as thin as I can across the panel. I again use the talc powder to stop the cocktail stick sticking to the putty. It is now a case of keep going until the whole panel is covered. This does take time, but there is a time limit. I found after around 40 to 50 minutes, the putty becomes too hard for the Zimmerit tools to work properly. That's why I did one section at a time, then move on to the next. For the Zimmerit pattern, I use these Zimmerit tools by Trumpeter. It comes with a set of rollers and stamps for 2 different scales. Now it's a case of rollering and stamping the entire surface. It's important to remember that Zimmerit was never perfect, and it's that inconsistency which makes applying by hand so authentic. The stamp is especially helpful going around features and in tight spaces. Once complete, I use the old airbrush needle to clean up the edges. It is vitally important to do all the cleanup and molding before it cures. Once cured, this stuff is hard as stone, and you will never get it off. The final stage is to add battle damage. I use a pair of tweezers to pull off small chunks of the Zimmerit. And that's the process I use for applying Zimmerit coating. Now, it's just the small task of applying to the rest of the vertical faces of the Tiger. This does take a fair amount of time, but in my opinion, applying it yourself is well worth it and gives an authentic feel to the tank. If you don't feel that this process is for you, Tamiya do sell Zimmerit sheets for most of their German tanks. I have never used them, but I'm sure they're a hell of a lot faster than applying your own. With the Zimmerit done, that's where we're going to leave this video. Next time, I will be tackling the photo-etch elements and get to work painting this beast. If you have enjoyed this project so far, please can I ask you like the video and subscribe to the channel? That would be boss. Thank you for watching, and until next time, happy modeling everybody.